A quorum being present, the Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing on the juvenile justice system. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us as we engage in a growing national conversation about how to set at-risk youth and juvenile offenders on the pathway to success. Some may be wondering why the Education and the Workforce Committee is holding a hearing on an issue that might otherwise fall under the Judiciary Committee's purview. After all, the words crime, court, judge, jail are not terms we frequently hear in this committee. So why are we here today? Because keeping our communities safe and supporting at-risk youth requires more than an adjudication system and a detention facility. It requires education, rehabilitation, and family participation, a joint effort by parents, teachers, community members, and civic leaders to prevent criminal behavior and support children who have engaged in illegal activity. The stakes are high for these youth and the communities they live in. Research shows children who have been incarcerated are up to 26% more likely to return to jail as adults. They are also 26% less likely to graduate high school. These are hardly the outcomes vulnerable children and their families deserve. They also have detrimental short and long-term effects on our society, imposing costs on the taxpayers and jeopardizing the safety of others. This is an issue that directly impacts our families and our neighborhoods, and we all have a role to play in addressing it. Recognizing the value of a collaborative approach to juvenile justice, Congress passed the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act in 1974. The goal of the law is to educate at-risk youth and rehabilitate juvenile offenders so they can become productive members of society. The law is based on the premise that the juvenile justice system can create positive opportunities for children who would otherwise go without. As we will hear from our witnesses, many juvenile justice programs have helped children develop the life skills they need to hold themselves accountable and earn their own success. Of course, not all programs have experienced the same results. That's why states and communities are constantly looking for new ways to better serve at-risk youth. For example, many states are investing in alternatives to juvenile detention facilities, such as community and family-based support services to help children get back on track. It appears these efforts are making a difference. Between 2001 and 2011, crime and incarceration declined dramatically across the country. The rate of incarceration fell by 46%, and the rate of juvenile offenses fell by 31%. While these trends are heading in the right direction, we still face the stark reality that there are more than 2 million children involved in the juvenile justice system. Meanwhile, many more are at risk of entering the system because of difficult circumstances that too often lead to juvenile delinquency, such as poverty, broken families, and homelessness. As we discuss ways to better serve at-risk youth and juvenile offenders through education and rehabilitation, we have the privilege today of hearing from Sloan Baxter, someone who faced many of these challenges as a juvenile offender and who knows firsthand how community-based programs can set youth on a better path. Mr. Baxter, thank you for the example you're setting. By sharing your story with us today, you're helping make a difference in the lives of others. We look forward to hearing from you and the rest of our distinguished witnesses. Before I conclude my opening remarks, I want to commend my colleague, Ranking Member Scott, for his long-standing leadership on this important issue. I look forward to hearing from him today and to working with him in the future. With that, I yield to Mr. Scott for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for calling this hearing today on the juvenile justice system. You have properly explained why juvenile justice is in this committee, the Education and Workforce Committee, not in Judiciary. And that's because the most effective solutions to juvenile crime and delinquency are prevention, particularly education, and not waiting for crimes to occur and responding with the criminal justice system. It's been over 100 years since we have established a juvenile court system in America. The juvenile system recognized that children are generally less capable of having the requisite intent and maturity to commit crimes, and therefore a rehabilitative and educational response to their misconduct as opposed to a criminal justice response is more appropriate. Over the 20th century, state juvenile justice systems evolved separately and without federal oversight. In time, many became to resemble the adult systems with little focus on children and their rehabilitation. In response, Congress passed the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act in 1974. It creates the federal guardrails that protect our children in the juvenile justice system in each state. JJDPA has three main components. The first act established core protections and other mandates that states must adhere to regarding treatment of children in the juvenile justice system. It authorized formula and competitive grants to help states run their juvenile justice systems in line with the federal requirements and provided delinquency prevention programs. And finally, it created the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, OJDP, to oversee juvenile justice programs. In the 13 years since we last reauthorized the program, there's been a wealth of knowledge and research that has been created that needs to be integrated into our federal juvenile justice policies. For example, we've seen positive results from some states have had from investing in alternatives to incarceration and secure detention. I know that our witnesses today will be able to speak to some of the work being done around the country in small residential settings as opposed to large child prison warehouses where, in reform schools that marred our past. We have also documented the power of evidence-based policies have in reducing crime and saving money. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention continues to fund and document practices and programs that have proven research bases and have marked the impact on communities through prevention and intervention. We have recognized the role that misguided school discipline practices coupled with an unresponsive juvenile justice system, what they play in creating what's called the school-to-prison pipeline, with students being arrested and referred to juvenile justice system for minor offenses at early ages that traditionally had been resolved in the principal's office. And perhaps more importantly, we've begun to realize around the country the role that trauma plays in the lives of disengaged youth. This is especially true in the lives of girls, the fastest growing demographic in the juvenile justice system. The FBI statistics tell us that between 1980 and 2005, the rates of arrest for violent offenses, including physical assault, sexual assault, and homicide, increased 78% for girls while declining 6% for boys. Research also shows that of girls entering the juvenile justice system, they are twice as likely as boys to report sexual abuse, and girls are 4 times more likely than boys to have experienced sexual assault. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that we know from briefings that will be taking place today at 11 o'clock, hosted by our colleague Karen Bass of California on this very topic, that is the rise of girls in the juvenile justice system and the link between sexual abuse and juvenile delinquency, and what some researchers are calling the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. We know that understanding trauma is often essential in these young girls and boys' lives, and it's essential to help them, in understanding that is essential to helping them turn their lives around. Now, policy changes alone are not the only reason we need to reauthorize JJDPA. The current reauthorization expired in 2007, and while the law still remains technically in effect, the authorization levels, the guidelines on how Congress should appropriate funds, are no longer in effect. We had a rude awakening in the House earlier this year when the appropriations bill appropriating money for the Department of Justice zeroed out multiple accounts under the Act, and since there's no current authorization to point to in law, we were unable to amend the appropriations bill to include some funding. The chairman of the subcommittee who zeroed out the funding did so by pointing out in part the fact that the program has not been reauthorized for 8 years and as such was either unnecessary or not a priority. The Senate recognized the need for federal funds and they restored the funding in their version of the Appropriations Act, but we're still likely to have the same problem year after year until we have a reauthorization of this program. The Senate has taken the lead in reauthorizing the Act, and they have a bill which passed out of committee and will be considered on the floor sometime in the near future. And I'm committed to working with you, Mr. Chairman, here in the House to produce a bill that will build on what we've learned in the last 13 years, and it's my sincere hope that we can get a bill on the President's desk before the end of this Congress. I look forward to hearing the testimony of the witnesses today and hope we can move forward in a bipartisan manner for reestablishing JJDPA as guideposts for the juvenile justice policy for our country once again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. It is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished witnesses, but I want to make an administrative announcement. We have a hard stop here this morning. It's somewhat unusual, but these are somewhat unusual times, at least on this side of the aisle. We have a hard stop at 11:45, so I'll be encouraging my colleagues to move with alacrity. So our witnesses today, we have Mr. Derek Cohen. He's the Deputy Director for the Center for Effective Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation in Austin, Texas. Mr. Cohen has presented several papers to the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and the American Evaluation Association on the implementation and outcomes of various criminal justice policy issues, including juvenile justice. Mr. Sloan Baxter is a youth advocate here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Baxter received help in healing at Boys Town's family-style, community-based therapeutic residential program after referral from the juvenile justice system. While at Boys Town, he participated with other system-involved youth in publishing a collaborative book of poetry entitled Concrete Dreams. Mr. Baxter successfully graduated high school and currently works full-time as a coffee barista and runs his own home improvement business. The Honorable Stephen Teskey serves as the Chief Judge of the Juvenile Court of Clayton County in Jonesboro, Georgia. In 2012, Judge Teskey was appointed to the Criminal Justice Reform Council, focusing on reforms to juvenile justice in Georgia. He is a past president of the Council of Juvenile Court Judges of Georgia and is a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Dr. Tim Goldsmith is Chief Financial Officer with Youth Villages in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Goldsmith has direct responsibility for the clinical research placement services and performance improvement departments at Youth Villages, an intensive youth diversion and intervention services program, and has been directly involved in the development and implementation of evidence-based programs at Youth Villages. I will now ask our witnesses to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize each of you to provide your testimony, let me briefly explain our lighting system. We allow 5 minutes for each witness to provide testimony. When you begin, the light in front of you will turn green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow. At the 5-minute mark, the light will turn red, and you should wrap up your testimony as quickly as you can. This high-tech hearing room that we've got here in the Visitor Center actually gives you a clock, so you can take a look at that as well. When we get to questions from members of the committee, we're going to limit that time to 4 minutes instead of 5 minutes because of the hard stop that we've got here. So if you'll start to edit your questions now, that would be good. Mr. Cohen, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the rest of the committee for inviting me here today. My name is Derek Cohen. I'm the Deputy Director for the Center for Effective Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and in our Right on Crime campaign. We thank Chairman Klein and the committee for taking up this important issue. While not the widely most understood element of public policy, juvenile justice is certainly one of the most critical. In Texas alone, it costs us 8 times what it costs to incarcerate an adult to incarcerate a juvenile. In the community, that is 4.5 times. These costs per day pale in comparison when taking into account the potential long-run expenses associated with repeat offending, costs reasonably expected to accrue if the juvenile criminal's activity continues unabated. The malleability of juveniles' behavior, however, offers great potential for rehabilitation and great potential for the youth to be diverted from a life of crime. Like its adult counterpart, too, juvenile justice has experienced a rampant uptick in the application of law and formalized proceedings to address behavior of dubious criminal blameworthiness. This is experienced twofold by juveniles, as they are subject not only to the prevailing criminal law, but also to a body of status offenses, actions not criminal if committed by an adult, like truancy, incorrigibility, or running away, and so on. While not traditionally criminal in nature, these offenses still might land a juvenile behind bars. The valid court order, or VCO exception, included in previous reauthorizations of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, permit the confinement of status offenders for failing to honor a court order mandating they do not commit a specific reoffense. Not only does this confinement of status offenders cost precious resources and limited juvenile compliant bed space, it often fails to address the root causes that triggered that offense in the first place. Further, it suggests that the state's role is to intercede with disciplinary issues traditionally reserved for family and the community. In 2013, an estimated 2,524 youth were detained, with the most serious crime being a status offense during a one-day census. An analysis of the data gathering methods conducted by us at the Texas Public Policy Foundation suggests that this estimate may actually underestimate the total by 3.68 times, the true number of status offenders being confined over the course of a year being closer to 8,404. Removal of this exception from future reauthorizations of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act should strongly be considered. We've made key reforms to our juvenile system in the state of Texas and produced noteworthy results in state-level commitments and general expenditures in juvenile justice. Each session, legislators have implemented reforms, some minor, some major, that prioritize community-based treatment alternatives to costly incarceration, and a bill that went through this session aimed on keeping juveniles closer to home. This bill is estimated to save tens of millions of dollars over the next 5 years, as well as produce better outcomes in recidivism. In fiscal year 2006, 2,738 juveniles were committed to secure facilities in Texas. By fiscal year 2013, the number of commitments have dropped to 818, a drop of over 70%. This drop allowed the state to close or consolidate 7 facilities. These reforms were attended by a commensurate drop in nominal spending, with state expenditures on juvenile justice being the lowest it's been since fiscal year 2001, a drop of 16% from 2005 to 2012 alone. If done properly, juvenile justice policy can intervene in a nascent criminal career, preventing future victimization at the hands of the offenders and drains on law enforcement and correctional resources. However, selecting and implementing these practices must be left to the respective states, who stand to gain both financially and socially from getting it right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baxter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Klein and Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee. My name is Sloan Baxter, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. I'm 22 years old, and I'm here to share my personal experience with the juvenile justice system. I was the at-risk youth we're talking about today. Like a lot of other young people who find themselves involved with the juvenile justice system, my family and I had challenges. My parents did the best they could, but both my mom and dad had drinking problems when I was young. By the time I was 11 or 12, I had become used to taking care of myself and doing things without much supervision. At school, things were up and down for me. I have ADHD. Teachers didn't always know the best way to help me. At home, I started staying out late and hanging out with older guys. But by the time my parents realized the path I was on and tried to correct it, I didn't want to hear it. I started getting in serious trouble at 14 years old. My parents separated. I came back to visit my dad, and we got into an argument on a late night. My dad was intoxicated, and I had been drinking as well. After that argument, I left the house, and although I'd never been in trouble with the law before, I decided to try to steal a car. I broke the car window, but didn't get any further than that. When I walked away from the car, I was quickly caught by police and arrested. Breaking that window, trying to steal that car at 14 was really a cry out for help, an effort to control things that were out of my control. I know that now. I was detained at a youth service center, which is YIC, and placed on probation that I didn't comply with. I continued to miss curfew, drink alcohol, and occasionally smoke marijuana. There was no positive intervention with me at this point. Probation monitored me, but didn't do anything to implement help or assistance in my circumstances. I was ultimately committed to DYS, or Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. Despite no new charges and a low risk level in the community, I spent most of the next year locked up at YC. and then Oak Hill, which was a detention center for young youth. Oak Hill was a terrible, terrible place for me. The kids would get in fights with each other, fight guards, and pretty much just run around as they felt need. I was 15 years old and depressed when staff from Boys Town came out to Oak Hill to interview me. I didn't know what to expect, but when I arrived, it was so different from the institutional locked facilities where I had been. Boys Town was the first place that I had went where I felt that people actually cared about what they did and they actually cared about what I did. It was a positive, non-hostile environment. The expectations to learn and succeed were clear. It was a family-oriented atmosphere, and I lived with my family teachers, the trained married couple who implemented the Boys Town motto of care and support of staff. Peyton and Yadelska Wynn became like a second set of parents to me. At Boys Town, I had individualized care, while Boys Town helped me, and finally, me admitting that I had a problem and them giving me the help I needed, I ended up going to rehab. And then I went back to finish the program with the Wins. Through the good times and the bad times, Boys Town was persistently supporting me. I was actually able to help other guys in the house, and we were a positive influence on one another. With all the skills I had learned at Boys Town, I became a peer mediator at school, and I graduated successfully in 2012. Life still presents difficult circumstances, but now I have the skills to handle those situations as they come. I didn't learn anything positive locked up at YC or Oak Hill, but at Boys Town I learned all kinds of skills that I still use today with my family and on my job. I have been employed with the same major corporation as a coffee barista for 4 years at Union Station. And I run my own small home improvement business. I'm self-reliant, and I have a better relationship with my parents today. My dad and I had a lot of struggles, but now I can actually tell him I love him. I haven't been rearrested, and I won't be. I have different visions for my life and possibilities for myself. Boys Town was a program that helped me and so many others just like me turn our lives around. But I'm not any different from any of those guys in themselves. The difference is that someone didn't just lock me up and give up on me. Instead, I got help and support in my community, and I was able to take charge for myself for the long term. I easily could have been a statistic. Instead, I'm a taxpaying, contributing member of society. There is that possibility in every young person. As you, me, and all of the rest of us willing not to give up on them before even really giving them a chance to start. Thanks for inviting me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Judge Teske, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning, Chairman Klein, Ranking Member Scott, and members of this committee. In addition to the 16 years I've spent on the court, I've been involved in the juvenile justice system in many other capacities. You've mentioned one, Chairman Klein, and that is serving my governor, Nathan Deal, on the Criminal Justice Reform Commission. But I state that specifically because we studied the juvenile justice system, and it resulted in sweeping recommendations that were unanimously approved by our state legislature. This morning, I would like to focus on our current juvenile justice system and the need to reauthorize the JJDPA. We do not have a national centralized juvenile justice system. Consequently, laws, policies, and procedures can vary widely from state to state and among local jurisdictions. This creates a patchwork of juvenile justice systems that result in inconsistent outcomes for youth, families, and communities, including youth exposure to physical, mental, and emotional injury. To address these inconsistencies and improve outcomes for youth and community safety, Congress passed the JJDPA in 1974. This act is designed to bring consistency in juvenile justice best practices among all the states by identifying 4 protections based in research that are core to delinquency prevention and rehabilitation. I'll name them quickly. The deinstitutionalization of status offenders, DSO, Status offenses are not crimes if committed by an adult. They include skipping school, running away, unruly behavior, and possession or use of alcohol. Under the JJDPA, with rare exceptions, status offenders may not be held in secure detention because it introduces them to truly delinquent youth that becomes a training ground to delinquency. Jail removal. Youth charged with a delinquent act may not be detained in adult jails, and for the same reason, status offenders should not be locked up with delinquent youth. Children are housed in adult jails are 8 times more likely to commit suicide, 2 times more likely to be assaulted by staff, 50% more likely to be attacked with a weapon than children in juvenile facilities. The third one, sight and sound. Same reason. In those rare exceptions when children are placed in an adult jail, sight and sound contact with adults is prohibited. And then lastly, disproportionate minority contact, DMC. Studies indicate that youth of color receive tougher sentences and are more likely to be incarcerated than white youth for the same offenses. States are required to assess and address the disproportionate contact of youth of color at all points in the justice system. The JJDPA is intended to create a federal-state partnership for the administration of juvenile justice and delinquency prevention by providing funding, planning, and technical support to address the core protections. JJDPA has been a game changer in the juvenile justice field. For example, when I took the bench in 1999, my county was inundated with high commitment rates to state custody, overwhelming probation caseloads of which most were kids of color and nonviolent offenders, and high reoffense rates. Using an approach mirrored in Ranking Member Scott's Youth Promise Act, I created a number of evidence-based programs and practices using federal funding. These programs seeded by federal funds from JJDPA have accomplished the following. Number one, an 83% decrease in our detention population, a 75% reduction in detention of minority youth, a 77% fewer commitments to state custody, 70% fewer commitments of minority youth, and despite all of that, our juvenile crime rate went down 62%. In our efforts to reform juvenile justice statewide, which was led by our governor, Nathan Deal, these Clayton County programs have become a model for reform. We have seen great success in Georgia, but we must be able to continue to capitalize on that momentum to ensure our children and communities are safe. To that end, I recommend the following. Number one, enhance judicial training to keep up with the specialized field of juvenile justice. Reauthorize the JJDPA for the reasons I just mentioned, and so that new research and evidence-based trauma-informed practices can be implemented nationwide. Strengthen the disproportionate minority contact core protection of the JJDPA, and eliminate the use of detention of status offenders and promote less harmful and more effective alternatives to detention. Given the momentum in the Senate with the recent passage of the reauthorization in the Judiciary Committee, I believe this committee must begin its work to reauthorize the outdated JJDPA. Chairman, your committee now has an opportunity to improve upon an historical and strategic act of Congress that has assisted states like mine to keep our communities safe and put youth on a better path. I want to express my gratitude to you, Chairman Klein, and this committee for holding this hearing, and I look forward to working with you in any way I can.
Thank you, Judge. Dr. Goldsmith, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairman Klein and Ranking Member Scott, for having us at this setting today. I'd like to talk a bit today about what it's like for a provider to work with these families. We serve youth and families and the community across the nation. With recent events with some of our troubled young people, it's even more important that we take this focus now. Members here have already mentioned some of the alternatives to juvenile justice and also some of the decrease. Let me tell you a bit about our work and our charge. Youth Villages is a nonprofit organization serving more than 23,000 at-risk youth and their families in 12 states in the District of Columbia, and even in these states of some of the members here, and also in this judge's court. Our organization has received numerous accomplishments, but part of them are focused on the issues that were mentioned here already: cost effectiveness and positive results and impacts. That has been our focus. In my role as Youth Village's Chief Clinical Officer over the last 26 years, I've led the development and implementation of intervention aimed at improving the outcomes of at-risk youth. But I want to be clear, we did not start there. Initially, all that we were was a congregate care lockup facility. At that point in time, we had a good bit of outcome research that showed us, surprisingly to us, that the more treatment that we provided in a group setting, the worse the kids did. Imagine our chagrin when we found out the longer they stayed, the worse they did. At that point in time, we changed our intervention strategy and focused on intensive in-home services, particularly intercept and multisystemic therapy, which addresses the needs of youth who've been involved in the juvenile justice system and in the foster care system. Many of the youths, as Sloan mentioned here today, have challenges, but these trajectories can be changed. These young people come from chaotic, troubled, and it's already been mentioned here, the trauma that these young people have is dire. The families are in dire circumstances, and more importantly, in many locations, many people believe that these youth are beyond repair. These youth have had trauma, they have real challenges in thinking skills, and now over the past 10 years, we know even more about the impact of growing up in trauma and impact on adolescent brain development. We know more now. So many of our programs now focus on changing these trajectories. It is intensive, it's family-focused, it's cost-effective, with a major focus on safety, a major focus on the impact on victims, and that most of these youth have been victims themselves. A quick story about Ben, a young person that we worked with in our multisystemic therapy program, 40 criminal charges before we became involved with him. After that, he was placed in our multisystemic therapy program. He and his family were seen for 3 weeks and remarkably did well. And even when he got finished, went back to some of the people that he had stolen from and asked for an apology and apologized to them and offered to work for them for free. So, so there is evidence, and strong evidence, that the interest in community-based services works. We can do more. Initially, when we started, with judges like this one next to me, it was a tough sell because they were concerned about community safety, and certainly that is true. But our results started speaking for themselves, and our programs were strengthening families and strengthening communities. 75% of youth, and as been mentioned here before, in youth facilities are confined for non-violent offenses. The interesting part is that these children, these young people, they will come home and they will be taxpayers and they will vote. And so we need to do what needs to be done now to be able to make certain that that happens. And as has been noted, scientific evidence suggests that incarceration is not developmentally appropriate and that youth confinement may actually lead to a higher risk of reoffending later in life. Our experience has shown that these programs work as long as they are family-focused. They allow us to address the root issues within families, and they allow us to focus on the concrete needs of all families, and it's also cost-effective. On average, $426 a day for youth in a residential setting compared to $100 a day for these, for our programs. I believe that our work demonstrates that alternatives to juvenile incarceration are not only necessary, but possible and cost-effective, because these youth will be back in your community. Ultimately, this benefits everyone because these stronger families mean stronger neighborhoods and stronger communities. Thank you very much for your interest and allowing us to speak.
Thank you, sir. Thanks to all the witnesses. Stayed within the time limits remarkably well. I will remind my colleagues that we're going to be limited to 4 minutes because we have the hard stop in 11:45, just over an hour, so I'll recognize myself for 4 minutes. I'm just going to keep going with you, Dr. Goldsmith. You were on a good roll there. We hear a lot, I hear a lot about how one-size-fits-all approach is not very effective, that you need multiple approaches. Could you just take a couple of minutes and elaborate on why multiple approaches are needed and why they work?
Certainly. It's interesting when you note that when a good number of youth, when they go through the juvenile justice system, typically for the first time, they're typically referred for two things: individual therapy and parenting classes. And I know the judge knows this. Some of the judges also know that the #1 least effective intervention for youth like this is individual therapy. The dilemma is, in many courts across the nation, is that they have no other options. They provide what they can unless the judges have worked with their states and with their federal legislatures to provide services. So most of these youth who come in are, we work within multiple systems. We work with the family, we work with the youth individually, we work with school systems, we work within the community, and most importantly for these young people, we work with their peer groups. So the one size really, you're exactly right, does not fit all. You have to work across multiple systems to provide impacts. When you think of a parent who had a negative experience in school and perhaps were a dropout themselves, and then you ask them to go and advocate for their youth in that school system where perhaps that same principal was the person who kicked the parent out. So it takes a tremendous amount of work across multiple areas that focuses on a large number of different strategies and a large number of different interventions for parents. I have yet to meet a parent that did not want to be a good parent. Lots of times they just don't know how.
Thank you very much. I yield back and now recognize Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me follow up with Dr. Goldsmith. How does the bill, Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, fund the programs that you're recommending?
I'm not fully familiar with all of the different components of how the bill funds these. I know that it has a focus on delivering alternative to juvenile justice services, and it was the initial start of that. Some of the components that the judge mentioned in terms of confinement are also a component of some of the programs that we serve, particularly in reference to disproportionate minority confinement. But I'm not familiar with all of the components of that.
Thank you. Judge Teske, I noticed that nobody suggested that we try more juveniles as adults. Could you tell me what you can do for juvenile in juvenile court to reduce recidivism that criminal court judges can't do?
Yes, sir. First, in distinguishing the role of a juvenile court judge from an adult judge really comes down to, the juvenile and the adolescent brain of the juvenile. I mean, their frontal lobe isn't developed till age 25, and that's the part that supposed to be holding the hands to the rest of our limbic system. So, and they're hormonally, charged up. So we have to be more patient with them. We have to give them time. They're under neurological construction. I mean, they're neurologically wired to do stupid things, okay? I'm not saying they're stupid, because they have a great capacity to do wonderful things. But we can destroy that capacity if we use a hammer, okay, to beat them up. And so we need to slow down. We need to take the system, slow it down. And to follow up, on Dr. Goldsmith, keep in mind there are 8 criminogenic factors. There are 8 causes of delinquent behavior. And that's why the one size fits all can't work, because kids may have different reasons for why they're committing delinquent acts. Family function, their peers, substance abuse, cognition, okay? And so what we are able to do is that we can fashion things, okay? A treatment plan. In the adult world, there are no treatment plans. It's either this, 1 to 5 years, mandatory minimums, 20 years. I mean, who's talking about fixing them? Put on probation, have conditions of probation, now go and sin no more. We don't do that in the juvenile justice system, or we shouldn't do that in the juvenile justice system. We need to slow down, fashion treatment plans. It's not about punishment. It's about helping fix these kids and their families.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen, you mentioned Right on Crime is focused on reducing crime and saving money in the process. Can you give a few examples of programs that reduce crime and save money that you have been involved in?
Certainly. Just confining it to the state of Texas alone, over the last, 2 legislative sessions, 2 things we've engaged on are issues of ticketing. How do children come about getting these Class C misdemeanors? In 2013, Senate Bills 393 and 1114 functionally removed the ability for ticketing on Class C misdemeanors from school. Now, those misdemeanors in school, basically turned into an adult criminal record very, very quickly. we had the same issue going on up until this last session with truancy. We had similar success in the state of West Virginia. West Virginia had just passed their Senate Bill 393, which addressed many of the confinement on status offense issues, including truancy.
Mr. Cohen, my time is about to expire. If you could provide those to us in writing, as many of those programs as you can, so we can review them.
Be happy to do so.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Dr. Fox, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank our panel today. The information you provide has been very enlightening. I did have an opportunity many years ago to work with a facility that worked with children who'd been sexually and physically abused. And their focus after many years became family-centered. And I learned a great deal at that time about the efficacy of family-centered therapies and family-centered treatments. So I'm really pleased to hear the comments that you all have been making about the programs that you're highlighting here. Dr. Goldsmith, I'll try to follow the example of my chairman and ask you a question. You and other witnesses have testified to the importance of using evidence-based interventions, and my colleagues will tell you I'm a big fan of that. In your experience, how do you most accurately measure interventions for their effectiveness?
It's a great question because lots of times people have interventions with no evidence, and there are those out there. What we do in our programs, all of the evidence-based strategies that we use, the best ones have what we call fidelity measures. And so it's like having a plan and you want to be certain that you follow the plan. And so we have measures that we use in ours that allow us to track the integrity and how closely the intervention strategy follows the way that the model was developed. That's most important because lots of times people go to training, they get some training, and then they leave, and then they go out and attempt to implement the intervention. And if there's no ongoing strategy to know, are you doing this the way it was designed, then it doesn't happen. The second thing that we do at our organization, that we measure the impacts of our programs 6, 12, and 24 months post-discharge. So because we are looking for long-term lasting change, and what we want to be able to do is to show a funder, a representative, a parent, if you put your child and you and your family participate in this program, we can tell you what the results are based on what your presenting issues are at 6, 12, and 24 months post-discharge across the 5 main areas that impact juveniles, which would be school, association with law enforcement, mental health needs, and a return back to a long-term care setting. Those are the types of things that we measure because that's what people are interested in. Basically, if you finish the program, are you in school and are you a functioning member of society like all adolescents should be? So that's how we go about doing the fidelity measures and the outcome measures.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Pocan, you're recognized.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. I know our ranking member, Scott, has made a long career of trying to have juvenile justice reform, and having this in this committee is really appreciated, so thank you. Mr. Cohen, I am one of the more progressive members of this body, and I'm a big fan of Right on Crime. I spent about 20 minutes last year on the phone with Grover Norquist and talking to him specifically about this. And I know Ranking Member Scott asked you to share with us in writing some of the other reforms. My question is, how many states are you currently doing this in with Right on Crime is active, and do you know that?
Yes, if we're including adult interventions as well, we're active in about 39 states.
39 states. That's fantastic, because this is an issue where, again, we've been tough on crime, but I think we're finally getting smart on crime.
Sir.
And we're working together, and this is, I think, a great collaboration. Can you, on some of the programs that you're doing that you're aware of, what can we do at the federal level to help incentivize some of these reforms?
Well, to be honest with you, sir, I think the important thing is to point out the successes that these reforms have had in the states. These are reforms that have not only saved money in the short term, they've also saved exponentially more in the long run when we back out the cost of repeat offending, back out the cost of, the marginal cost of the justice system. These are all areas of savings that we have for getting the policy right. In Texas, I mentioned in my oral testimony, we consolidated much of our juvenile system, prioritized the regionalization, kept juveniles and treatment closer to home so that they still can be integrated in their community, still can be integrated into their school system. By that, we have spent, 16% less, and this is in nominal dollars over the course of a decade. With inflation, that's almost 20% less. So these are the types of selling points that should be made to the states. Now, the states themselves are, the police power, which includes the juvenile justice system, ultimately belongs to the states. The states should recognize it in their best interest that this is what they can expect with these programs.
Sure. No, appreciate that. Thank you. Let me ask you another question. It's a little bit of a curveball, I guess, but unfortunately, some people at political season still try to take advantage of this, and we watched this in Nebraska in a congressional district where they ran very much a Willie Horton type ad based on the reforms that you're all advocating for and doing in states like Texas. Is there anything that we can do around that? Because I think there's such a great left-right alliance on this. This shouldn't be a partisan issue at all to try to move forward. How can we try to stop that kind of behavior to try to really move these issues forward?
Well, I think the proof of concept to that particular question is simply in the statistics. We've made these, in some, minor reforms in some cases, aggressive reforms in others in the state of Texas, and we have the lowest crime rate that we've had since 1968. The reforms advocated by right on crime is not tantamount to soft on crime. We still punish. However, we just make sure that when we do, we just don't take to borrow from the doctor and the judge, we don't take a one-size-fits-all approach. If we have a low-level offender that can be better treated in the community and at no cost of public safety, let's do that. That is going to cost us, 10 times less than it is to actually reserve bed space for that issue. And that person's going to still pay taxes, that person's going to still maintain contact with their family, they're still going to work their job. These are all benefits that you don't have if you just incarcerate as a knee-jerk reaction.
Sure. No, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, just in closing, in Wisconsin, when I was in the legislature, Scott Walker, as a state legislator, Gwen Moore as a state legislator, and I had helped place a ban on placing juveniles at the Supermax prison. We used to have 16 and 17-year-old kids there, so it can really work, and I just want to, again, applaud Right on Crime and what they're doing. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Rokita, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate everyone's testimony. Back when I used to practice law, I did a bit of juvenile law, and Judge, I'll tell you, it really didn't matter, frankly, what my clients did. My goal was to try to keep them out of the system, because I knew if they succumbed to the system, we were going to lose them forever, most likely. And your professional testimony, each one of you, reaffirms that today, that I thought I was doing the right thing back then. Now, that doesn't mean we let them go. We really presented the court with a lot of strong options and consequences and try to take care of the problem ourselves. Now, that was 20 years ago, and it seems like the practice, the industry, even if you want to call it that, has gotten a lot better, and your testimonies are proof of that. I really only have two questions, and then the first one would be to Mr. Cohen. I want you to reemphasize what it takes from an options perspective to not let these persons become repeat offenders.
Certainly, and that's, that I would actually throw back also to the testimonies from Dr. Goldsmith and Judge Teskey as well.
Please.
Is that
I'll let them comment too.
The one size fits all approach, it never works, and that's also why Right on Crime specifically advocates for keeping most of the juvenile justice interventions at least primarily a state-level initiative, because the offenders in Texas aren't going to look like the offenders in Alaska and California, Vermont, et cetera. So having multiple options because of the varying criminogenic risk factors, having multiple options because of the various factors that cause the intersection with the criminal justice system are all issues that need to be addressed, and those are best sussed out at the local level. The people have the most hands-on data for what their specific needs for the juvenile system is going to look like. So what we did in Texas, or one of the general models that we use in Texas, is that we have a commitment-based refunding model. In other words, once we set a baseline of how many people are referred to the state, anything above that baseline they have to pay for. Anything below that baseline, they get a bit of a refund for. This is a kind of a micro version of the incentive-based funding models that you see a lot of the providers use in other states.
Judge, same question. Anything to add there?
I agree with Mr. Cohen. In Georgia, we've done the same thing. We have a juvenile justice reinvestment program. The problem has been in the past, going back 20 years ago, is what I call the default problem, where judges are looking at a kid and they don't want the kid to go to jail, to be committed to the state, but they say, but I don't have anything in the community for this kid, so by default they do that. So we had to get money to the local level, just like Texas, and that's how we did it. But specific to your question is this: we need to follow what we now know after 40 years of research, which has made juvenile justice truly a specialized field, okay, and distinguishes us from the adult court judges, is very simple. There is what's called the risk principle, the needs principle, the responsivity principle, and the treatment principle. I don't have time, of course, to go into it, but as I once told Congressman Scott about 2010, Google it. Just go to what works in community corrections, juvenile justice, and you can get it, and that's how we're supposed to do it.
And Doctor, let me have you yield. I want to get to Mr. Baxter, if you don't mind, in 15 seconds. Mr. Baxter, what advice do you have for kids coming up and following in your footsteps, so to speak, so that they don't get trapped in this system?
I would have to say the biggest thing for me was my peers and seeing how they were affected differently because they couldn't express themselves differently. So their perspective was very statistical. I would probably say...
How do they avoid your missteps?
The gentleman's time has unfortunately expired. Ms. Fudge,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Scott. And thank you all for being here today. Judge Teske, in your experience, what effect does poverty have on the youth you see in your courtroom, part one? And are there any programs that you're aware of that deal both with rehabilitation of the young person, but also pathways out of poverty for their families?
Excellent question. Poverty, as we know from the research, can drive crime. And it's about time that we start taking a look at poverty as a driver of crime and developing programs around that. Let me just put this in a nutshell, okay? We need to study juvenile crime like we study diseases, all right? You identify at-risk populations, identify the causation, and then develop a treatment plan. Diseases don't occur by chance. Diseases are not randomly distributed. Disruptive behaviors don't occur by chance. They are not randomly distributed. They can easily be studied and they can be fixed. But when we study them, we find what the drivers are. I've already mentioned that there are 8 of them, but we're finding out there's one. I think eventually there'll be one called trauma added to it. But even deeper than that is what reason there's a lot of trauma is because we get it from our poor kids who are coming to the court. 80%, we do trauma assessment in our court. As much as 80% of the kids who come in our court have been traumatized. Traumatized people traumatize people, okay? Now, what are the programs to do that? There's a number of them, have been mentioned here: functional family therapy, multisystemic therapy, cognitive restructuring, the 7 challenges in terms of drug treatment. But it must go deeper than that. We must build relationships in our community among both the private and the public sector, the businesses as well as the public. What we've done in Clayton County is we develop an independent backbone agency with a board of directors. The school system, which houses kids every day, Monday through Friday, they send the chronically disruptive kids to this independent backbone agency to do what? To assess, develop a treatment plan, monitor, get programs in the home, and most of them are poor families.
Thank you very much. And I want to go back to Mr. Sloan. First, I'm sure that you hear from people all the time, Mr. Baxter, how proud we are of you, and I am proud of you today. And I thank you so much for being here. And I thank you for providing your deeply personal account of how you ended up here today. So my question for you is, what do you think that we can do? What kinds of positive interventions or interactions that we can have with young people before they get to Oak Hill?
One of the things that worked for me best was I always had someone talking to me who knew a little bit more about things than I did. And so regardless of where I was, it was always someone who would notice me because I would observe things where I was at. I didn't really get into the physical aspect of being in these facilities and things like that. I was more of I had to stimulate my mind almost to keep sane. So with that being said, the biggest thing was people believing in me. Because with someone believing in you, they have to give you responsibility. And with responsibility becomes failure. Failure makes you learn. You're on your own. So I would say them giving me the firsthand opportunity to fail or succeed on my own.
Well, thank you. I think you're a great success. Thank you for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing today. It brings me back to a number of years ago when I was in the state legislature, and while my wife and I are away, our oldest son was assaulted on a bicycle trail, a bicycle destroyed, and fortunately he didn't lose his eye. Two thugs, juvenile delinquents as they were called, beat him. And what was frustrating was when we offered an opportunity to the courts for alternatives to incarceration in a juvenile home, and that alternative was for them to spend the month of August with our family, my son, who they had beat, and myself, scraping our barn and painting our barn together, and suffering the wonderful opportunity to eat my wife's home food cooking. But more than anything, we thought it would give an opportunity for an alternative, them to see victims as human beings, and for our family to work in turn with them attempting to right a wrong. And that wasn't allowed by the courts. And I know one of those went on, or both went to juvie home, and one went on to prison subsequent to that. So hearing today this discussion is important. Dr. Goldsmith, how does work fit in when we discuss the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act?
I'm sorry, I don't fully understand. So
How does work fit in? I guess I'm talking about the dignity of work. We often today don't talk about work being dignified. Any work, any good work is dignified, no matter how much remuneration you make. How does that fit into the the Delinquency Prevention Act?
Right, right. As been mentioned here, it was a critical component. You heard Mr. Baxter talk about his work experience now, and it's all part of the community systems that we try to embed youth in when you work in-home, family-focused community systems. Part of that system is the community, and you try to find those support systems within that community. Work is an essential component of where that can occur. Another one of our programs works with youth who are exiting the juvenile justice system, and we just finished a randomized clinical trial of that program with good success. A big component of that is the educational and vocational aspects of youth becoming involved in their community and involved as a tax-paying working citizen. So over and over and over again, our impacts show the greater exposure they have to law-abiding working adults, the better their experience later. So,
And meaningful work opportunities.
yes, sir. I mean, I would imagine if you showed up in Judge Teskey's court with the exact same case, he would probably go with you. Would be my suspicion.
I would hope so.
But those sorts of opportunities are rare, quite honestly, because as Mr. Baxter has mentioned, lots of times when you get into systems, they see these kids as beyond repair. And they just need a consequence. And if you really stop and read files about what do these kids actually experience, it is horrendous.
Let me just jump over to Mr. Baxter and ask, what challenges did you face in trying to find meaningful work?
I do home improvement on the side now, but I was doing it with my dad for a while, and it wasn't something I would see myself doing for a longevity of time because of how strenuous it is. Outside of that, because he was my dad, he could, of course, give me a job, but I started wanting more independence for myself to say I did it for myself.
Okay.
Kind of with like negative and positive reinforcement.
What do some of those that you see in the juvie system right now, what challenges did you see for them in getting that? You went on and did your own, but I see my time has expired.
Right now, with their
I'm going to
Thank you, Mr.
rescue
Chairman.
you, Mr. Baxter. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Desaulniers, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for this hearing and the panelists. It's I'm going to date myself. I worked for a juvenile court in the 70s in the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I've always had an area of had interest in this because of that through local government in California and state government. But what I want to ask you about, particularly Mr. Cohen and the judge, is sustainable funding. So in California, one of the things we've struggled with is when the economy is doing well, we put money into intervention and prevention, particularly for young people. We now know what the best investments are, but bringing that to scale and maintaining it's been a struggle. Might be somewhat unique to California because we depend too much on capital gain tax, so when we're doing well, we do this. But because juvenile probation doesn't have a big political constituency, it's always a struggle. So at one point, when I was in local government, the Foundation Consortium in California, Irvine and Packard, came to us at the state level and the local level and said, we're not funding any more programs unless you do a reinvestment strategy. And over generations, we know you can save money if you do intervention and prevention. So can you talk a little bit about sustainable funding, knowing we know what is going to be the best, even though it takes, as you say, not one size fits all. Judge, could you talk about it a little bit, maybe Mr. Cohen?
Yes, sir. Let me use first Reclaim Ohio, because they were the first in the country to do reinvestment and redirect. Established in 1995, yet it survived, okay, the economic turndown. And so I like to use that as a model picture for, you know, sustainability in terms of funding in the most difficult times. And what it's really about, and it's going to depend on each state, whether it's a home rule state or whatever, in terms of how it governs. But in Georgia, you know, what Governor Deal has done is say, okay, we are going to create a special line item, okay? We're going to put it in the Department of Juvenile Justice budget. We are going to have staff around that, manage that. There's a lot, you know, the devil's in the details. What's happened because of these reforms, bed space has gone down. So, for example, those counties, which are many, that have received the reinvestment money, we call them incentive grants, the commitment rate is down 62%, okay? So imagine how that resonates in terms of funding. Already, in this short time, we've already saved the state $85 million, okay? Now, not all $85 million needs to go back into juvenile justice, right? Okay? So everyone's winning on this, including the infrastructure of the state, whether it be transportation or whatever. But we are dedicating those monies, okay, on this formula basis to go. Now, the reason we got the money much sooner is because Governor Deal smartly said, ask the legislature for $5 million, okay, to hurry up and fuel this and get it started quick so the reinvestment money can be realized sooner.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen, I don't want to exceed the chair's admonition about my 4 minutes, so if you could just briefly.
Certainly, and Judge Teske did very well to point towards Ohio's Reclaim program and as so far as how a juvenile adjustment reinvestment strategy could work. The only thing I would add to that conversation is I am not aware of a particular model of jumpstarting a reinvestment that doesn't require at least a small a modicum of upfront cost. Now, you can expect to recoup that cost in a very short time horizon on many of these programs, but to think that it's nothing but just a downhill cost slope is a bit premature.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I yield the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Carter, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Let me start off by saying for the past 10 years, I've had the honor of serving in the Georgia State Legislature. And during the legislative session of 2013, I was actually a co-sponsor of the juvenile justice reform that you speak of, Judge Teske. And we passed that during that session. It was signed into law in May of 2013 by Governor Deal. As you just stated, it went into effect in October of 2014, and in the 9-month period, we've seen a 62% decrease in cost. And that program has really turned out to be a great program. We're very proud of it there. What I want to ask you very quickly is that, you know, phase one, which included new intake procedures, education, and family support, we saw the felony commitments go down, as I mentioned. Do you believe that works, the family support and the education part of it?
Yes, sir, it does. And by the way, let me say thank you for your yay vote, okay? Sure. Yes, so we use, to give you an example, most of the counties now, if not pretty much, maybe all of them, but by far most of them use functional family therapy and multisystemic therapy because the #1 cause of delinquency by way of research is family function, okay? So if you have family dysfunction, that becomes the greatest cause. So you want to create the best protective buffer, and that's to build up the family, which means you have to get into the home to do it. You have to stop just treating the child. You have to look at the family, which tends to be many of the origin of the attitudes and other behaviors of the child leading to delinquency. Yes, we have found it to be true. My probation officers are tickled pink that they have FFT. Yeah. They are seeing a difference in the parents.
Well, let me mention also that while I was in the Georgia State Senate, I also served as chairman of state institutions and properties, which included being on the Appropriations Committee and being over appropriating for corrections. And we were faced with cuts that we were forced to make as a result of the decrease in revenue in our state. And part of those cuts that we made were to move some of these like truancy and curfew violations that we had in the most secure juvenile beds. We moved them down to the less secure and to the at the family and at home probation. And Mr. Baxter, what I want to ask you is this. Now, please understand where I'm coming from. I ask you this because I suspect that you know people who've been through both the most secure facilities and the less secure facilities. Can you tell a difference in those people?
Yes, I can. I'd say the ones that have the higher security are 9 times out of 10 they're more likely to come out worse than they were when they first went in. When they come back, they're more aggressive. When they come back, they're out of tune with society. Things updating in technology and everything is always up. They come home, nothing's the same. So now you've taken somebody and you've erased everything they know, put them somewhere, taught them something that it's either prey or predator almost when you're there. So when you come back out, they have that same mentality because nothing is there to prevent that from happening. So it's a recycled mentality. So they do come out worse when it's a higher level of security opposed to a program that implements skills to go back into society.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Baxter, for being here. Thank all of you for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Wilson, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Klein, I was excited to hear that you were calling a hearing on the subject of prevention and reduction of juvenile delinquency. As you know, I have dedicated my life to saving young men of color from the juvenile and criminal justice system. So I'm delighted for this committee to take up this issue, and I welcome the panelists here today. I also applaud Ranking Member Scott for his tireless leadership and unwavering dedication to this issue. I know we share the strong commitment to preventing poor outcomes for at-risk youth, especially young men of color. From my personal experience as a school principal, I know how important it is to reach children and give them the support, encouragement, and resources they need to make good choices for themselves and their futures. I also think there should be greater emphasis on school-based intervention and prevention programs. Almost a quarter of a century ago, I founded the 5,000 Role Models of Excellence program, a program that has provided a model for dropout prevention initiatives across the nation. Since its inception, 5,000 role models has awarded more than $10 million in scholarship to minority boys and helped thousands of young men turn their lives around. There are 98 chapters in the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, the fourth largest school district in the nation. Both Representative Cabello and I represent them. There are 70 chapters in Pinellas County Public Schools, which is St. Petersburg, Florida, and there are 40 chapters in Duval County Public Schools, which is Jacksonville, Florida. They take field trips to prisons, jails, and courtrooms so they can see firsthand how their actions can impact their lifelong goals. They have choices, extremely important choices, so they're exposed to the right choices and the wrong choices. They tour colleges, universities, and technical institutions. The 5,000 role models founded its own fire college to train emergency medical technicians and future firefighters for the entire state of Florida. We partner with Cadillac dealerships, the Pipe Fitters Union, and the Port of Miami to train its future workforce. These young men are also taught to respect the law, respect women, respect teachers and others who are in charge. They learn to respect their elders, their parents, respect their peers, and respect themselves. They learn all this from people who love them and take time to listen to them. This is a school-based program that encourages these boys of color to remain engaged in school. Studies show that when children are more behaviorally and emotionally engaged in school, they are less likely to be delinquent. As we move forward, I urge my colleagues to focus on this connection and how reauthorization of JJDPA can reflect this reality. Mr. Baxter, I want to commend you for your work and turning your life around. Can you tell me, do you think you would have benefited from an in-school-based program to give you the encouragement, support, and one-on-one mentoring you needed at the time when you said you were in trouble and probation did not help you?
I did a few school things. One, I can't remember the name of the program, but it was basically a metropolitan police program where they have certain officers inside schools and they pick like 1 or 2 students out of the school to go to this program. I can't remember the name of it, but that was one. But Boys Town also helped me out a lot because any facility that I was at a different school now. Chelsea School is basically a private school for kids with LD. So the times that I got sent out of state, my counselor would hop on the horn and bring me my work so I could stay caught up on my IEP and my curriculum. So yes, school does help a whole lot. Yes.
I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you that have come to testify today on such an important subject. I want to thank the chair for taking this subject up and giving this some time for us to discuss. I'm got kind of a unique perspective. I was a former prosecutor, but also a former defense attorney, so I've seen both sides of this, and I've also kind of witnessed firsthand the mentality in the judicial system with regard to crime, and that in many cases the solution is always throw in the book at whomever that person is in front of the court that day, as if that would solve all problems. We know firsthand that, in fact, that's not the case, and especially is true with the nation's youth. There are opportunities to intervene. There are opportunities to provide alternative sentencing and ways to address issues that aren't necessarily just punitive in nature. That's why I'm really grateful that, Mr. Baxter, you're here today to really share. I think it's very brave of you to be here, for you to share your personal experience, to use that negative in your life as a positive to help influence others in the future. And the fact that you're here today discussing public policy in ways that you can take your experience and expand it across the board for everybody to benefit from, I'm proud of you. And I just want you to know that. I'm very proud of you for being here today. And I'll give you a chance to speak, but I want to ask you, you were talking about when you were 14 years old and you broke that window that day. Did you have any experience beforehand? Tell me about your family experience. I know you said there was alcohol involved at the time. Did you have an intact family unit? Tell me about what was in your mind that day that caused you to go down that path.
That day I just wanted to get away. I wanted to get away from everything. A car means you're mobile, so I could go anywhere I wanted to at the time. but of course I was unsuccessful at that. The biggest thing was I was trying to control something that I had no control over. My parents tried to control me, and they didn't have control over me either. So it's basically that challenge when things. The perspective I had then was more so like, if one thing doesn't go your way, and you start out as an A, it's harder to maintain an A than it is to start from an F and make it all the way back up. So that was kind of me wanting things to be right, wanting people to notice, getting the attention to make that difference, but I just expressed it in the wrong way, which eventually cost me more in the end.
So obviously you were thinking of the consequences down the line. You were expressing yourself at the time, but you indicated that you've had experience in both the heavy traditional form of incarceration and also with Boys Town. What lessons did you learn in Boys Town that got you where you are today? I am impressed by the fact that you have just absolutely turned your life around and now are using your lesson as a tool for good.
They definitely give you social skills so far as time management, which I still work on that one. There's some other ones, being self-reliant, in everyday things, disagreeing appropriately, which was a really big one, and that's a really big one for youth all around the board as well. That's something that we don't know how to do. There's debate and there's argument. You know, there's no disagree appropriately. That's unheard of. So they also have a point card system, which basically keeps track of your positive and your negative behaviors for the day, which reinforces if you'll have your privileges at the end of the week or you don't. If you don't, you have to work on skills every day until you make those privileges back. So it's something that you end up internalizing after a while because it's actually what you want. They give you more responsibility. The more you learn, the more responsibility you get.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Clark, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Scott. And to Mr. Baxter, I just want to say, first, we all struggle with time management, as the chairman can tell you. And but mainly, I want to thank you for giving voice to millions of young people with your testimony today, and just tell you how much I admire your courage and your eloquence and the way you're building your life. And we have seen great successes, and I'm grateful to the panel, not only for being here today, for your work over the past few decades, and really the decrease that we've seen in juveniles who are in the criminal justice system overall. We've come very far from when I was a prosecutor in the early 90s, and we had the mythology that was so corrosive to our public policies of the super predator juvenile that was, coming to our families and to our homes, and very grateful that we've come so far. But there's one trend that we're seeing that is alarming to me, that arrests among girls have grown by 45%, and detention has grown 40%, while we're seeing an overall decrease. And for girls of color, this is even more startling, 3 times as likely to be referred to a court and 20% more likely to be detained. Recent report just came out that said girls are over 4 times more likely than boys to have been sexually abused before their juvenile justice involvement. So my question to you, and we touched Chief Judge Teske on this in your testimony and in response to some questions before, is trauma-informed practices are critical to how we do this. Can you explain a little bit in a practical matter what that means in the courtroom?
Yes. First of all, in a practical way, it means, first of all, very basic, is making sure that doors don't slam and make noises. It means stop shackling kids in the courtroom that don't need to be shackled.
Do you see higher rates of shackling for girls?
Well, there are still plenty of jurisdictions that do indiscriminate shackling. They shackle everyone who comes into the courtroom, regardless of the nature of the crime they're charged with, which is counterintuitive to the presumption of innocence. But other things, you know, we need to be more practical. I can help explain the increase. We changed the laws around domestic violence. So now the states have, you know, when the police arrive, whoever the predominant aggressor is, identify that person and remove them. Well, because girls, with their unique needs and the trauma that many of them suffer, their behavior becomes their language. His behavior became his language. And so they pick up a knife, but that's just what they're doing. They're trying to speak. They do it through their behavior. They get arrested. That's when you start seeing the increases. If we can start looking at exceptions and mitigating factors for girls in these circumstances, we're going to do better off.
Thank you. And can you tell me, implementing these trauma-informed practices, have you seen a difference in recidivism? Do you have those stories to tell?
Yes, I do, and I can send those to you. I'll be glad to do that because I know we're getting ready to run out of time.
Right.
And but yeah, I'll be glad to do. But yes, it's not anecdotal. You know, we do have statistics around that where trauma-informed practices make a difference.
Thank you.
I think the gentlelady and everybody's awareness of time management has gone up. Mr. Allen, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for sharing your work here with us today. And Mr. Baxter, you have an incredible testimony. And I'd just like to ask you first, obviously you are mentoring younger people. What is it that you share with them that would have made a difference, which would have turned your life around before you went down the, I mean, do you have to experience these things like, youth detention and things like that to learn a lesson, or is there some way we can get to them early before they actually make maybe the same mistakes you did?
I think it's definitely a way to get to it before it happens. One way I think Ms. Wilson was saying was definitely about school, because school is directly connected to your home. That's the only way that you would be able to get in between that, between the community, the youth, and the school. So these are all things that are kind of necessity for us to have something on our mind at all times. Then I didn't really know, the perspective of an adult to a youth, so I was kind of lost. And me being lost, I was trying to find my way. So yeah, I might have known you touch the stove, you might get burned. I know that, but I'm going to do it anyway, to see how it goes, So I was curious. I was very, very curious because no one was telling me anything. So I had to find out on my own. So something I would have to say it would be schools oriented.
Judge, you, Governor Deal, have worked extensively on this justice reform in Georgia, and I congratulate you on your efforts. One of the things that's concerning to, or should be concerning to all of us, is the fact that for whatever reason, the family is not working. And it's very difficult out there for our kids. I mean, they're the ones that suffer. What do you see is how can we restore the family unit in this country?
I made reference to it earlier, but I'll mine it down a little bit further, and that is in our local communities, building collaborative relationships that laser focus on our families. My suggestion would be that the best formula is to identify the kids who are dropping out of school. I mean, who would ever think that keeping kids in school would improve graduation rates? Okay, But the thing is that how goes graduation, so goes crime. And so that's why juvenile justice is so important, because all kids become adults. If you want better adults, than help our kids. And so what that means is that the formula goes like this: develop a profile of the kids dropping out of school, then determine their needs. You're going to find that most of the kids dropping out are from poverty and are traumatized. Then you have to develop a collaborative community plan that strategically addresses that. And like I said, what communities are doing now are developing these independent backbone agencies that are referral sources, and that's the laser focus that gets into the homes where schools can't get, courts can't get, you see. Yeah.
Yeah, schools have a tough time. We had a superintendent say, you know, I could do a lot better job if I had better parents. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Davis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly look forward to a strong bipartisan reauthorization of the juvenile justice bill. I really appreciate Mr. Baxter. We always point to whoever's here, the young person who, because it's important. It's so important to hear that voice, and so I appreciate the fact that you related to the fact that people would need to be up to date on technology. The world kind of like has gone by when someone's in a detention facility that is not reaching out in the way of bringing people up to date. But I also wanted to ask you more about the training of staff, of individuals, of providers in a few areas, certainly in terms of anything related to sexual assault, abuse, and also how they deal with racial implicit bias, cultural competency. Did you see a big difference in terms of the staff that you interacted with in these different facilities, like the community versus the detention facility? And what should we be doing? Is this something that should be built in any kind of legislation that we do, that we're making sure that people are being trained properly?
I'm glad you asked that question. There's a difference in training very much from a person who's at a detention center from someone who's at a residential campus that teaches you things. The residential campuses, of course, they have minor defense for themselves. At these facilities, that's all they're doing. All they're doing is managing people. You know, you don't really have a voice, so they're managing physical bodies. That's their job. Their job is hands-on. With other programs and things, programs like his, they have to find out who you are first, and then they put things in your way for you to run back around and get, almost as planting a small seed and letting it grow. So yes, the training is very different so far as between detention centers and places like Boys Town and things like that, because they don't have the skills in these facilities, lockdown facilities. They don't have the skills. They're not trained on that. You know, they're not trained to emotionally stabilize someone or anything, or give them too much more knowledge outside of what they may already know. So yes.
Okay. And for those of you, Judge and others, is it too naive to think that some of those skills could be built into any facility? Or do you think you think they are actually?
Well, no, I think it is too naive, quite frankly. I'm gonna go out there, because think about it for a moment. In Georgia, 65% of all kids who go into a secure facility reoffend within 3 years of getting out, and of crimes much worse than what put them in there. 40%, nearly 40% of the kids we put in secure lockup in Georgia were low-risk offenders. That's not a really good investment on taxpayer dollar. And I agree with Mr. Baxter. It's because when you put kids in a secure facility, you've separated them from their family. We've all been, everyone here who's spoken has acknowledged it's about the family. Well, how can you really be serious, and I be serious, about fixing kids when we know family's number one, but we put them in prison and take them away from their family? And now I'll shut up.
Okay. I think my time is almost up. I wanted to just ask, and as we move forward, because this is the Education and the Workforce Committee as well, of understanding what kind of communication, what kind of support, what kind of training is necessary to expand in our schools. What would you build in? What would you like to see in as we move forward. And we know that there are great schools that do a good job, but I think it should be part and parcel of everything that we do, and appreciate your input. Thank you.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Corbello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baxter, thank you for your very valuable testimony. You have a very moving story, but it's also a personal story, and it takes courage and humility to state it in such a public forum. So thank you very much, also for giving us a good example of what works and what doesn't work. It's clear to me that we're in the midst of a fast-paced evolution in the juvenile justice system. In Miami-Dade County Public Schools, where I had the privilege of serving on the board, as did my colleague, Ms. Wilson, who you heard from earlier, they have done away with out-of-school suspensions, something that would have been unheard of just a few years ago, and something that I certainly support. So it's clear that we're moving from a punishment-based system to a rehabilitation-based system, from exclusion to inclusion. What I want to ask you, and I'll get to as many of you as I can, is what do you think we can do through a potential reauthorization to accelerate the pace of this evolution and to really have a smart, youth-centered juvenile justice system? I'll start with Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, sir. Well, you mentioned out-of-school suspensions, and that was an issue that we looked at briefly in the Texas legislature. You know, the issue with out-of-school suspension is that, especially if for an issue like truancy, you're going to punish the child for skipping school by making sure that they don't go to school. It just tends to be one of those nonsensical issues or nonsensical ways of addressing a serious issue. When it comes to school discipline writ large and what the federal government can do, I would actually say it's about making the information known of what has worked in the various states that it has worked in. When it comes to some sort of mandatory compulsion through a grant scheme, I'm not necessarily sure that always is going to get the outcomes that this body wants, simply because that creates a dependence on the federal government for something that they should be wanting to do themselves. Now, there are practices that probably should be incentivized over others, but that in and of itself doesn't mean that the state or even the locality should be going to the federal government looking for them to fund a particular program, when it's the state or the locality that stands to reap the windfall of getting it right.
Mr. Baxter, do you think that there are activities that we can incentivize through this reauthorization to perhaps encourage more of the programs like the one that saved your life through this reauthorization?
Probably the most positive thing I could come out with that is most likely mentor programs. Because like I said, when I was young, I just simply didn't have anyone to kind of go through it with me or explain what exactly I was feeling. So I would say mentor programs.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything they'd like to add?
Yes, sir. First of all, if you could go to the 2010 report from the Federal Advisory Committee for Juvenile Justice, there is a chapter in there on school-to-prison pipeline that I chaired and helped draft that gives specific recommendations. But as to the reauthorization under DMC, kids of color in some studies are 6 times more likely to be suspended out of school than their white counterparts for the same offenses, okay? So that's low-hanging fruit. If we can incentivize where some way schools can develop, you know, alternatives to suspension, like we in the courts are doing alternatives to detention, you know, we could really, really hit this DMC issue really good. And maybe also take a look at the IDEA, because up to 70% of kids with disabilities have been reported being incarcerated in juvenile facilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Grothman, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. Couple questions. First of all, for Mr. Taskey, you mentioned a second ago the role that poverty plays in these problems. It's always been a pet peeve of mine when people talk about poverty, because to me, poverty in our society is not, when I think of poverty, it should be, you're old enough to remember, pictures on Time magazine of Biafra or Bangladesh and kids with protruding stomachs. In our society, poverty means living in a heated and air-conditioned apartment. Recently there was a study that I think 85 or 80% of the people in poverty have at least 2 TVs, most have cars and such. I'm going to ask you, is the problem kids living in poverty, or is the problem kids living with a difficult home life with a welfare lifestyle? In other words, is it a material problem, or is it a problem of parents providing a horrible role model for their kids?
The issue of poverty is extremely complex, and I understand, you know, the foundation of your question in distinguishing Bangladesh and here, and I certainly understand that. Here in the United States, while there are some places, even in Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains, there are folks who are living without, but let's go to the urban area. That's really what we're talking about. Yeah,
Not necessarily, but
yeah, but, you know, but in the urban area, you know, when we talk about poverty, you know, we're talking about the gunshots that he heard, okay, the alcoholism and things that all, that's true. But what's causing that to happen even to the parents, okay? And especially given the fact that, unfortunately, in this country, we still have a problem of too many people of color in poverty. I'm just going to tell you, from a white Southern judge, okay, which we were pretty good at Jim Crow laws and slaving people of color, okay? I'm just going to tell you right now, it's a matter of histrionics. You know, after 300 years of doing that, just because we have a whole lot of freedoms that happen overnight doesn't mean that people can get out of that hole overnight. So that, it just simply...
You're avoiding my question. Poverty is normally an economically defined term. Is the problem an economic one in which people do not have enough money, or are we dealing with a more of a social situation in which we have people who, by historical and world standards, are wildly wealthy?
No, both. I'm sorry, sir.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's both. It's both, but it's driven first by money that then leads to all the social issues. As Mr. Baxter is here shaking his head up and down because he personally lived it, you know. And I see it too. I was a parole officer in inner city Atlanta for 10 years. I dealt...
Do you really believe the problem is a lack of things you can buy with money? Do you really think if somebody's living in a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, air-conditioned apartment with gadgets and enough food that you're obese, that the problem is a money problem, or is it a role model problem with the parents?
No, well, I think it's all of that. See, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it's all of that. The question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? You know, I mean, you know, it's not only that they're living in a project, okay, but it's where the projects are with the guns and the drugs and all that around them that itself creates trauma.
I'll ask the final question of Mr. Cohen. One of the things that bothers me when you guys generate statistics, and you're all good at generating statistics, is in determining the root causes here. You look at educational achievement or in poverty, however that's defined, but you don't talk about family background. Could you give us some statistics of family background, you know, the type of family you're with and the degree to which that is impacting the people that wind up in the system?
Let me interrupt here. The gentleman's time has expired. If you have that answer, Mr. Cohen, if you could submit it for the record, that would be very helpful.
Will do.
We're about 3 minutes away from a hard stop. I want to thank the witness for being here today. I want to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from Fight Crime, Invest in Kids into the hearing record on behalf of Mr. Thompson from Pennsylvania. Hearing no objection, the letter is submitted. And I'll now recognize Mr. Scott for any closing remarks he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think we've heard a fairly consistent message, particularly from Right on Crime, that we can reduce crime and save money by making strategic investments in prevention, early intervention, rehabilitation, especially education, family therapy, and trauma-informed services. Judge Teske mentioned that a way of doing this would be through a process similar to the Youth Promise Act. We've heard support of the core requirements, and it appears that there's a consensus on approving legislation. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you as we reauthorize the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act and ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a list of policy recommendations from the Juvenile Justice Coalition Act 4.
Without objection. I thank the gentleman. I want to again thank the witnesses. I will add my thanks and congratulations and admiration to Mr. Baxter for boldly stepping forward and sharing his story. I commend you, everybody at the table, but the statistics that Mr. Grothman was talking about in terms of recidivism and lower incarceration and all seem to be moving in the right direction, exception being what Ms. Clark was talking about with girls, with young women. So we've got some work to do here. You've been very, very helpful. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.